Welcome to Ask the Hard Questions, Season 1, Episode 7. The Two Faces of Paul, Luke and Acts. This is the episode where Luke and Acts stop being background reading and step into the witness stand. Most of us were trained to treat Luke and Acts like one smooth movie. Same author, same Theophilus, same orderly account, no questions asked. Paul steps onto the scene, the camera follows him, and we're told this is what Christianity looks like. Jerusalem gets a cameo, Paul gets the franchise. But when you slow the tape down, the story splits. You do not get one Paul, you get two. You get Paul of Acts, the law-respecting, festival-keeping, temple-purifying, rumor-denying man who insists he has done nothing against the customs of the fathers. The Paul who circumcises Timothy, rushes to make Pentecost, pays for vows, and lets Luke defend him as a good Jew to the very end. And you get Paul of the letters, the one who swears before God that he did not receive his gospel from any man, who did not rush to Jerusalem, who can live as without law among those without law, who calls the law a yoke of slavery for Gentiles, and says if righteousness comes through the law, Christ died for nothing. Same name, same man, two profiles, two agendas, and a church system that pretends there is no tension at all. In this episode, we drag that tension into the light. We look at how Luke tells the story in Luke and Acts, how the resurrection to ascension timeline changes from same day to 40 days, not as a slip, but as a theological remodel that wraps Yeshua in Moses' 40-day pattern. How Acts 1-5 shows a Jerusalem community still breathing Torah, daily in the temple, one table, one fear, one obedience. While modern, not under the law religion raids Acts for miracles and throws out its lifestyle. How the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 is not a law-shredding manifesto, but a Leviticus 17-18 doorway for Gentiles to leave their pagan filth and enter a holy community. How Luke's Paul is polished for Rome and synagogue ears, while Paul's own letters sound like he is fighting a different war with different weapons. We walk through the speeches. We talk about how ancient historians worked, how they composed speeches to fit the moment, how Luke openly tells you he is compiling, arranging, and ordering from prior accounts. This is not body cam footage. This is a case file. Spirit-breathed, yes, but still a case file. Witnesses, timelines, bias, selection, emphasis. And then we ask the only question that matters. Who gets to overrule Yeshua? Does any narrative in Luke or Acts get to cancel, soften, or reinterpret what the king already said about the law, obedience, and the commandments? Does any theologized timeline get to erase, if you love me, keep my commandments? Does any harmonized picture of Paul get to turn, do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets, into, relax, it's all gone now? If your system needs Luke and Acts to erase Torah and gut the words of Yeshua, your problem is not complex scholarship. Your problem is allegiance. In the two faces of Paul, Luke and Acts, we are not here to throw out Scripture. We are here to stop lying about what it actually says. We are here to let the fractures show so that the foundation, the Father's law and the Son's commands, can stand where they belong. No more hiding lawlessness behind the word grace. No more using Acts as a wrecking ball against Moses. No more pretending Paul and Yeshua preach the same thing when their followers use Paul to disobey the king. If you are tired of being told, don't ask that, if you feel the contradictions but have been shamed into silence, if you refuse to serve a God who rewards disobedience and calls his own words a curse, this episode is for you. Welcome to Ask the Hard Questions, the two faces of Paul, Luke and Acts. Ask the Hard Questions hashtag Eric Seeks Truth. Luke and Acts is not a children's story. It's a stress test. Same author, same addressee, same orderly account. And right out of the gate, the timelines don't match. Luke chapter 24 reads like this: resurrection, appearances, walk to Bethany, blessing, gone. No mention of days stretching on, no many weeks later, just a continuous story. Then he led them out as far as Bethany, and he was carried up into heaven. The natural read is same day or very soon after. Acts chapter 1 rewrites the clock. He presented himself alive after his suffering by many proofs, appearing to them during 40 days, and he was taken up. Now the ascension is 40 days after the resurrection, from the Mount of Olives, not the evening of that first day. Same author, same Theophilus, two different time shapes for the same event. You can't call that a rounding error. 40 is not a casual number in Scripture. 40 is Sinai. 40 is wilderness. 40 is testing and probation. By stretching the resurrection appearances to 40 days, the writer is not just giving history. He is clothing the risen Yeshua in Moses' timeline. 40 days on the mountain, receiving instruction, giving Torah. That is not raw footage. That is narrative theology. The timeline was bent on purpose. Apologists slap a bandage on it and say, ancient writers compress events. Luke just left the gap out in the Gospel and filled it in with Acts. Critical scholars say the quiet part out loud. The number 40 is a loaded symbol, and Acts is using it like a spotlight. Either way, you have to admit this. Luke's 2 volumes do not function like a modern police report. They are arranged, sequenced, and stylized. The chronology serves the message. Once you see that, you are done pretending Luke and Acts is a simple play-by-play. You start reading with eyes open for editorial hands. You stop asking, how do I force these two to match? And you start asking, why did he shape it this way? That is fracture 1. Fracture 2 shows up when you look at the law. Acts chapters 1 through 5 do not describe a church that graduated from Torah. They describe a covenant community where Torah is still breathing in the room. They gather daily. They continue with one accord in the temple. They break bread from house to house. They share possessions so that there is not a needy one among them. Acts chapter 2 verses 46 and 47 and Acts chapter 4 verses 32 through 35 paint a people all for one and one for all, not every man for himself and his ministry. Later, James and the elders tell Paul something the Sunday system pretends is not in the Bible. Many thousands of Jews have believed, and they are all zelotai tu nomu, zealous for the law, not culturally attached, not nostalgic for Moses, zealots, burning devotion to Torah. Acts stacks the evidence. They are in the temple for worship in Acts 2 and Acts 3. Peter and John go up at the fixed hour of prayer in Acts 3 verse 1. The festival calendar still matters. Paul hastens to get to Jerusalem for Pentecost in Acts 20 verse 16. And when rumors spread that Paul is teaching Jews to forsake Moses, the solution in Acts 21 is not, well, yes, that is our new doctrine. It is, prove the rumors false. Show them you yourself walk orderly, keeping the law. So they tell Paul, join these 4 men under a vow, pay their expenses, purify yourself in the temple, so that all will know that you yourself are living in observance of the law. Paul does not argue, he submits. Acts 21 verse 26 shows him in the purification rites, in the temple, finishing the vow. If you actually believe Acts, the mother church in Jerusalem does not treat Torah as obsolete. Jewish believers are devout in the law. Gentiles are expected at minimum to respect core commandments we are about to see in the council decree. That is why the modern not under the law system has to treat Acts like a museum it can loot. They love the building. They steal the aesthetic. They quote the miracles. Then they deny the architecture. They want the authority of Jerusalem without the obedience of Jerusalem. That is fracture 2. Acts affirms Torah. Later theology uses Acts to declare Torah dead. Then comes fracture 3, what Acts 15 actually is, and what the not under the law religion turned it into. The Jerusalem Council gathers to address one live question: what is required of Gentiles who are turning to the God of Israel? The apostles and elders deliver a decree, repeated 3 times, in Acts 15 verses 19 and 20, Acts 15 verses 28 and 29, and Acts 21 verse 25. They tell the Gentiles to abstain from 4 things. First, things polluted by idols. Second, blood. Third, things strangled. Fourth, porneia, sexual immorality. Most modern preaching treats that list as a random starter kit, or as proof that everything else in the law is gone. But if you trace the words back, that decree is straight out of Leviticus chapters 17 and 18, the section dealing with what God requires of both the native Israelite and the ger, the sojourner dwelling among them. Leviticus 17 bans idolatrous sacrifices and offerings to goat demons, that is, things polluted by idols. Leviticus 17 forbids eating blood and commands proper slaughter so that the blood is poured out, not left in the animal. That matches abstaining from blood and from strangled meat. Leviticus 18 lays out a full list of forbidden sexual unions: incest, adultery, male with male, bestiality, and more, branded abominations. That is the content behind the word porneia, the catch-all term for sexual impurity and covenant-breaking unions. This is not 4 random behaviors. It is the Leviticus 17 and 18 package applied to Gentiles. James explains why these 4 right in the chapter. For Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him in every city, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath. In other words, Gentiles have been hearing Torah read. These 4 are the minimum boundary lines that allow table fellowship and entrance into the community, without forcing full proselyte circumcision. This is not, you Gentiles only ever have to do these 4 things and nothing else matters. This is, you Gentiles must at minimum stop the core filth of pagan life, idols, blood, strangled meat, and sexual abomination, so you can sit at the table with God's people and go on learning His ways. The decree is a doorway into holiness, not a bulldozer to flatten Moses. The text itself calls these 4 necessary things, an-kaya, not optional, not negotiable. To turn Acts 15 into an anti-law manifesto is to take a Torah-rooted decision and weaponize it against Torah. That is fracture 3. Next, fracture 4. Paul in Acts versus Paul in his own letters. Acts works very hard to show Paul as Torah-respectful and innocent of the charges against him. He circumcises Timothy because of the Jews in Acts 16 verse 3. He takes a vow and cuts his hair at Centria in Acts 18 verse 18. He rushes to make it to Jerusalem for Pentecost in Acts 20 verse 16. He submits to purification and pays for the vow of 4 men to prove he keeps the law in Acts 21 verses 23 through 26. He insists under trial, I have done nothing wrong against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar in Acts 25 verse 8. Near the end, he tells the Jewish leaders in Rome, I have done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers in Acts 28 verse 17. Roman officials repeatedly conclude he has committed no crime. Charges about him breaking the law are portrayed as slander. Acts presents Paul as a good Jew to the end, keeping the law, precisely to reassure both Jewish and Roman audiences that this movement is not anarchic. Then you read Paul's own letters. In Galatians chapters 1 and 2, he insists he did not receive his gospel from any man, and he did not even go up to Jerusalem for years. He swears an oath, before God I do not lie, about which apostles he met and when. His motive is to defend an independent revelation and an authority not derived from the Jerusalem disciples. Acts chapter 9, on the other hand, shows him in Jerusalem much sooner, softening that gap. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul openly admits he can live like a Jew among Jews and like one outside the law among Gentiles. To those under the law I became as under the law, to those without law as without law. I have become all things to all men. That means he can eat with Gentiles in ways that would violate strict Torah boundaries. In Galatians chapter 2, he calls out Peter for withdrawing from table fellowship with Gentiles and accuses him of hypocrisy. Those are sharp moves you never see narrated in Acts. In Galatians chapter 5, he says Gentiles who get circumcised and put themselves under the whole law are severed from Christ and fallen from grace. He calls that path a yoke of slavery. He says if righteousness comes through the law, Christ died for nothing. That rhetoric is not the tone of Acts. Acts gives us a Paul who looks perfectly aligned with Jewish custom, whose problem is mainly hostile Jews misunderstanding him, and whose gospel is presented in ways that sound more like general Hellenistic Jewish preaching than the explosive language of Galatians. So what do we have? Two incentivized portraits. Luke wants unity, continuity, and a law-respecting, Rome-safe Paul. Paul in his letters wants to defend his direct commissioning and keep Gentiles from being dragged into proselyte conversion. Acts smooths, Paul sharpens. Acts paints harmony, Paul admits conflict. That does not mean either one is worthless. It means you stop pretending they are identical voices. Acts is rhetorically engineered, not a body cam stream. Fracture 5 sits in the speeches. Nearly a quarter of Acts is speeches. Peter at Pentecost, Stephen before the council, Paul at the Areopagus, farewell addresses, defenses before governors and kings. Ancient historians did not have audio recordings. They did exactly what Thucydides confessed. They composed speeches as they thought the speaker would have said, given the situation. Luke tells you in his prologue that many have compiled narratives and that he has investigated and written in order. He does not claim he sat in the back row with a stenographer. That means when you see Stephen's massive speech in Acts chapter 7, you are not reading a transcript. You are reading Luke's theology in Stephen's mouth. The style matches Luke's own Greek. The themes match Luke's favorite ideas. Israel's long pattern of rejecting God's messengers, God not being confined to the temple, the innocence of the new movement, the guilt of the leadership. The same is true with Peter's sermons and Paul's speeches. And notice what is missing in Paul's Acts speeches, the vocabulary that defines his letters. Justification by faith, detailed atonement language, the in Adam, in Christ framework. Instead, you get monotheism, judgment, resurrection, a message that fits a wider Hellenistic Jewish sermon profile and Luke's apologetic goals. The point is simple. The speeches are true in substance but crafted in form. They carry apostolic witness, but they carry Luke's hand. You do not build doctrine on one line from a composed speech without checking it against Torah and against Yeshua's own words. Fracture 6. Luke as compiler, not lone eyewitness. Luke himself admits that many have already undertaken to compile accounts. He says he has carefully investigated and writes an orderly account for Theophilus. That is the language of someone working with sources, not scribbling what he personally saw at every turn. Compare the Gospels and it jumps out. Luke leans heavily on Mark. Whole blocks of narrative in Luke follow Mark's sequence and wording. Baptism, temptation, Galilean ministry, miracles, passion. A large part of Luke is directly parallel to Mark, often in near-identical Greek. That is literary dependence. Then there is the material Matthew and Luke share that Mark does not have. Sayings like judge not, prayers, parables, temptations, beatitude-type material. Many see a sayings source behind this, called Q. Others argue Luke used Matthew. Either way, Luke is drawing from prior written material. Then there is Luke's unique content: the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, Zacchaeus, the Emmaus Road, his infancy narratives. That is Luke's L source: local traditions, community memories, and his own theological arrangement. He rearranges things, too. He moves the Nazareth rejection to the front of Jesus' ministry, to frame the story under rejection. He omits certain Markan stories entirely, likely because they did not serve his narrative aims. He adds a long travel section packed with parables that hammer his themes: mercy, reversal, the poor exalted, the rich warned. He loves to highlight Roman centurions and officials finding no fault in Jesus or Paul. He loves to show that this faith is no threat to Roman order. Those choices matter. Once you admit Luke is compiling, selecting, and arranging in his gospel, you have to extend that same honesty to Acts. The focus on Peter, then almost exclusively on Paul. The silence about the other disciples after a point. The careful pattern of miracles, trials, and acquittals. This is not everything that happened. This is what Luke chose to show. Which brings us to the real teaching point. What do you do with all of this? You stop treating Luke and Acts like a flat rule book, and you start treating it like a case file. A case file has witness statements, some with bias. It has evidence, timelines, and interpretations. Luke and Acts is inspired, but it is inspired as story, as compiled testimony, as theological history, not as a list of abstract rules. So we do 4 things. First, we value the exhibits. Luke and Acts gives crucial witness to resurrection, to the Spirit, to mission, to suffering, and to the shape of early community life. Second, we test the claims. We measure every interpretation against the plumb line of Yeshua's own words and the Father's commandments. Third, we watch the incentives. We notice when unity, respectability before Rome, or defense of a single personality seems to drive how the story is told. Fourth, we refuse to let a compiled narrative overrule the Master's commands. Yeshua already drew the line. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. Whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever does and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 19. He already defined love. If you love me, keep my commandments. John chapter 14, verse 15. He already defined speech integrity. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Whatever is more than these is from the evil one. Matthew chapter 5, verse 37. So when someone uses Acts to say, we are not under the law, so obedience does not matter, you do not have a new covenant insight. You have a direct collision with the king. When someone uses Peter's sheet vision to cancel dietary commandments, after Peter himself says the vision was about people and not about food, you are watching narrative twisted to excuse disobedience. When someone waves Acts 15 as a flag to claim the Old Testament is gone, you are watching Torah-based decrees turned into a wrecking ball against Torah. When someone idolizes Paul's travel miles but ignores Jerusalem's one table, one fear, one obedience, they are clapping for distance and ignoring holiness. Narrative shows what happened, or what the author wants you to see happened. It does not automatically define what God authorizes for all generations. Torah and the words of Yeshua do that. Revelation seals it. If a so-called gospel requires God to contradict himself, call his own law a curse, or smile at lawlessness he once condemned, you already know who authored that gospel, not the Father. So we read Luke and Acts with discernment. We honor the Spirit's work. We learn from the courage, the generosity, the inclusion of outsiders, the power of resurrection. but we never let a shaped timeline, a composed speech, or an incentivized narrative erase the commandments written by the finger of God or the orders spoken by His Son. No more hiding behind "we are under grace" to bless what God called sin. No more using fulfillment as code for abolished. No more quoting Acts to cancel the King. Ask the hard questions. Hashtag Eric Seeks Truth. Thank you for watching Ask the Hard Questions, the two faces of Paul, Luke, and Acts. If you made it this far, you already know, this wasn't just Bible study. This was surgery. We put Paul on the screen in two versions. The Paul of Acts, who stands in Jerusalem and lets Luke paint him as Torah-respectful, temple-honoring, vow-taking, "I have done nothing against the customs of our fathers." And the Paul of the letters, who turns around and calls that same law a curse, a yoke of slavery, a ministry of death written on stone, something that kills while the Spirit gives life. So which face are you supposed to believe? If the law written by the finger of God is a ministry of death, who exactly are you accusing, Moses or the one who spoke from Sinai? If the commandments are a yoke of slavery, what does that make the God who bound Israel to them, Redeemer or slave master? If the curse of the law is built into the Torah itself, then what do you really think of the covenant He swore by His own name? You don't get to hide behind slogans. You don't get to chant grace while you agree that God's own words are toxic. Acts tells you Paul stood in Jerusalem and said, in effect, "I've done nothing against this law. I keep it. I walk orderly." Then his letters go out into Gentile territory, and suddenly the law is the problem, the barrier, the curse, the slave yoke. So ask the hard question. Did he tell one story in Jerusalem to survive the riots, and another story in his letters to win the nations? Did he swear, "I am not lying," about his independence from the disciples, while Luke tells you a different timeline to make him look accountable to them? Is that how a faithful witness behaves? Two faces, two audiences, two messages? If the law was death in the letters, why was it obedience in Jerusalem? If Torah was slavery, why does Acts show a mother church full of zealots for the law, not refugees from it? If God supposedly moved on from His commandments, why does every attempt to move on end with more abuse, more lawlessness, more victims under a Sunday system that calls His words a curse and then calls that love? These are not academic puzzles. These are life and blood questions for people who have been hurt, lied to, and spiritually trafficked in the name of not under the law. I'm not here because it's profitable to ask this. I'm not doing this for clicks, sponsors, or a merch table at the back of the sanctuary. I don't take a dime to defend the law of God or to expose the contradictions in a system that weaponizes Paul while ignoring Yeshua. No donation button bought these questions. No tithing envelope controls these conclusions. I do this because I refuse to bow to a gospel that demands I call the Father a liar to feel saved. I do this because I have seen what happens when people believe God's words are a curse and then go out and treat human beings the same way. I do this because the King said, "If you love me, keep my commandments," and an honest heart has to decide who it really believes, the Son who walked in obedience or a system that markets disobedience as grace. If this episode shook something, go back and sit with it. Watch it again. Pause on the fractures between Acts and the letters. Look at the two faces of Paul and ask in your own soul, would the God of Israel really call His own law slavery, death, and curse, and then ask me to trust Him? Then don't stop here. Go watch the other episodes in Season 1. Each one is another layer of the same question. Who is telling you the truth about God? And who is asking you to swallow a contradiction and call it faith? Share this with the person who was told, "We're under grace, not law," right before they were devoured. Share it with the one who walked away because the God they were handed looked more like an abuser with a Bible verse than a father with a covenant. I'm Eric Osborne. I don't teach for a paycheck. I study, write, and press record so that ordinary people can see what happens when you follow this thing to its logical end, and then choose the king over the counterfeit. If you're ready to keep going, keep watching, keep testing, keep asking what the Sunday system told you never to ask, you're in the right place. If you want to keep pulling on these threads, don't do it alone. Follow me, Eric Osborne, at Eric Seeks Truth on Facebook, Messenger, Instagram, and YouTube, and subscribe to the Ask the Hard Questions podcast. That's where we keep tracing the contradictions, weighing them against the King's words, and walking this out to its logical end, together. I love you all and goodbye for today.